In this film we're going to be showing you how we're going to set our little garnet into the gorgeous, perfect oval silver bezel we've been making over the last couple of films. My name's Andrew Berry and welcome to At the Bench's YouTube channel. I mentioned in the last film, I'll put a link by there to it, that I was going to be answering some questions as well that the YouTube subscribers have been leaving down in the comments boxes below. I'll answer them a little bit later, but let's get cracking on and setting this particular stone. Now, we showed you in the last film, we used that little bit of dental tape, dental floss. Not quite sure where it's gone. Oops, there we go. Oh my gosh, knocking everything for six. Here we go. Here's our dental floss, where we showed you how we lay that dental tape over the bezel. We grab our stone and we just simply drop that down to place. The dental tape stays under the bezel, as you can see, like that. We can push the stone into place, see if it fits, make sure it goes in fine, and we can then pull the tape and the stone comes straight back out. But now we know the stone fits, we need to set the stone. Now there are various ways we're going to hold this bezel. If it's not in a ring, it's going to be that little bit more awkward to hold because we haven't got the ring shank to hold on to. So we need to find various ways that we're going to be able to hold this. The easiest way is literally hold it with your fingers on your peg like this, and then you can use your burnishes or your bezel rockers or whatever to burnish the stone into place. But what happens if your hands are just not that strong enough? Well, if your pocket's deep enough, if you can grab yourself a GRS mini vise that looks something like this. There are lots of other mini vices available. That allows you to put the bezel into the top here, like that. Move these little pins around. These pins can move around in the top here, and then we simply close this up and we've got the bezel held nicely in place. We can turn it around, we can spin it around and so forth. Absolutely brilliant. No worries at all with that. Nice and simple, but as I said, they do come at a price. The other way we can do that is by grabbing a piece of wood and doing exactly what that vise does, is put that bit of wood, that bezel onto the piece of wood, and then getting 4 little panel pins, little very thin pins, and put the pins around the bezel itself to hold that bezel close, nice and tight. So then you've got this bit of wood then that you can hold on to help you set, and when you burnish the metal over, you can hold on to the block. And if you haven't got a bit of wood, you can use another product from GRS. I'm not sponsored by GRS, I just have these products available. Other products are available. This is what's called a thermolock. You can also get something that's called Jet Set, which is a thermoset in plastic. With this, you can put that in the microwave, warm it up with a hot air gun, or put it in some hot water, and you can mold that into a shape, whatever shape you want. You can mold it into a rectangular piece that goes over your peg, something like that, and whilst it's still slightly warm, get the bezel and then push the bezel into the thermolock or the Jet Set or whatever it is, or put it into a ring clamp and make sure it's nice and soft, and push the bezel into it. And as then the material cools down, it hardens and holds onto whatever is in it and keeps its shape. And you can use that then to set the stone. And perhaps I'll do some films on various ways that we can use thermolock or Jet Set. So all that said, the one thing that I haven't covered is working on the height of the bezel. Now this is really, really important as well. If you have the bezel that is standing too high above the stone, you've got a lot of metal that you've got to push down onto the stone, and you're going to get wrinkles and it's not going to look very nice at all. Don't have the wall high enough and the stone sits in. You don't have any metal to come over the edge of the stone. So we also need now to trim this wall of our bezel down just so it's the right height. Now this is where my bit of dental floss is going to come in handy, because I'm going to put that over the bezel like that. I'm going to put the stone into place, and let's just see where that stone comes to. Push it down into place, That's looking really good. Not quite sure whether the camera can see this, but we've got a very, very slight gap just at the top of the bezel here. Now this is a Cabochon stone, and the Cabochon stone is sort of a convex shape, it's domed, so the sides, as they come up from the bottom, they bend over this way. And this is the rest of the stone. The wall just needs to come up that fraction higher from where the stone starts to curve over. And as long as you've got a bit of a gap between the top of that bezel, let me put it by there we go, between the top of the bezel and the curvature of the stone, that's all you need to hold that stone into place. Have too much of a gap and the metal, you're not going to be able to push it over successfully, it's going to wrinkle and so forth. So just that little bit would be absolutely brilliant. Okay, so the stone fits in nice and tight. And I'm just going to get the GRS vise to hold it in place. As I said, other ball vices are available. Just put that into place just to hold it. Now there are various tools that we can use to burnish over that bezel. And again, the bezel has to be a certain thickness. If it's too thick, it's not going to move. Too thin, and it's going to wrinkle. So refer back to the first film, just by here, if you wanted to. But don't do it just yet. Wait till you watch this, then come back and watch it. By here. We've told you the thickness of what bezel we're using. There are various then burnishes and rockers that you can use to push that little bit of a bezel over. My favorite is this. This is a very, very simple burnisher. It's nice and smooth, nice and polished, straight, no worries at all. We can use that to get onto the edge of the bezel and just burnish that over towards the stone. You can also use what they call more claw pushers, prong pushers, and this is simply a rectangular piece of metal with a groove down in the end, so it's a bit of a dip. We can use that to come along and just get on the edge of the bezel like that and just rock that bezel over onto the stone. Or you've got something called a bezel rocker, and again with this you can put that on the edge of the bezel and rock that around just to force the bezel over onto the stone. So there's those different types of tools that you can use to burnish the metal over. Now another little tip is you don't start at one end of the bezel and burnish and burnish and burnish, burnish all the way around, all the way around and all the way around until you come back to the start. That's the wrong way of setting. What you need to do is get your burnisher, decide on which area you're going to start burnishing the metal over, and what you would do is start perhaps at the end here and push the metal towards the stone. All right, a little bit, not a lot, a very, very small little bit. Now stop, go to the opposite side and do exactly the same on this side. Push it a little bit, but stop. Don't push the metal all the way onto the stone just yet. We want to trap that stone. If we push too hard from one side, the stone may lift up and not be completely flat. Now come onto the quarter side here. Get your burnisher, your rocker, or your claw pusher, whatever you're using, and just ease that metal down a little bit. And again, we just gently push that over slightly. Come over to the opposite side to that and do exactly the same to that. So now we've got the stone trapped. It's not going to lift, it's not going to come out. Now we've done that, we can go back in between to where we've gone on the, say, the quarter past and the half past, and just gently now push the metal over a little bit towards the stone. But again, stop, go 180 degrees over to the other side here and do exactly the same there. Now stop, come over here, 180 degrees over to the other side. Okay, and we work around the stone gradually as we go. We can go now in between those, just ease that a little bit like that, come over this side, ease that, over this side here, ease that, 180 degrees, come on over and ease that. And we can carry on going around the bezel now, working a little bit at a time. Remember, don't force it in one go, little bit, other side, little bit, 90 degrees, little bit, 180 degrees, little bit, and move it gradually, slowly and slowly. And you'll find by doing it gradually, you're not going to get any wrinkles. You're going to get a nice, smooth, even bezel all the way along. If you started at one end here and just pushed and pushed and bezel, 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 all the way and push the bezel, push the bezel, and you come around to here, what you may find the metal would be stretched, and you've got a bit of a ruck, bit of excess silver that's being pushed along to try and set, and that's just no good, especially if you've got nice thin bezels. So that then is how we would come to set our stone. We can carry on perhaps with the bezel rocker and just rock that now down towards the stone. By using tools that got nice smooth faces like these have here and the burnisher here, we're not going to impart any marks, deep marks, nasty marks in the bezel, and what you'll find is all you need is perhaps to go over it with a buff stick like this here, just on that outside edge, just to remove any slight scratches. Then you can come along then with a nice hard felt mop, he says, frantically looking. I must get this bench tighter. Here we go. You can come along with a nice hard felt mop like this, or a nice calico mop on a bench mounted polishing motor, and you can just polish the edge, taking very good care you don't let the brushes or the polish hit the stone, especially if the stone is a soft stone like a turquoise or an opal, or perhaps even some turquoise, opal, topaz, citrine, something like that. They're quite soft, so be careful. If need be, put a bit of masking tape or some sellotape or some duct tape, packing tape, whatever, over the stone to protect the stone, perhaps while you use your buff stick in case you scratch it, and also when you're polishing it, and you will get the most perfect bezel. So that's what we're going to do. I've shown you how we're going to do it, and that's how we finish off the bezel. Okay, like I was saying 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago, we're going to be looking at just a few questions that have been asked. They're in the comment section down below. So some of the questions were, what strength solder do you use for soldering the bezel joint and subsequently the bezel onto the back plate? Good question. Because we've got, in this instance, soldered the bezel to the back plate and soldered the jump ring, we've got 3 different soldering operations done in quite a small area. So if you are a beginner and you're not that confident with your soldering, the first solder joint, start with a hard solder, a high melting point solder. Then when you come on to the next soldering job, which would be the soldering the bezel onto the back plate, use a medium solder, which is the middle sort of melting point solder, and then soldering the jump ring onto the bezel or onto the back plate, or a bail onto the setting. I would then use a nice easy solder. These are all hard solders, by the way. A nice easy solder that has the lowest melting point of the 3 of them. But if you know what you're doing and you're skilled and you know exactly how the temperatures are going to work with the solders and you're handy with your torch, you can get away with using hard solder for all the 3 joints. Because once you've heated up solder the first time, say you're doing hard solder, you heat up solder, the solder flows. You've used up some of that solder's properties, some of the alloys in that solder. So when you come to melt another piece of solder, hard solder, next to it, because that new piece of solder is the correct alloy, it will melt at the correct temperature. But the original solder joint that you've just done won't melt because you've taken away some of the properties of the solder. It will melt at a higher temperature, which is very handy because you can use hard solder on the bezel, then you can use hard solder on the bezel to back plate, and then if you're really careful, you can use hard solder on the bail or the jump ring itself, because as you solder, the temperature, melting point of the temperature of the solders change, even if it's the same melting point solder. Hope that makes sense. Next question. Andrew, you use a lot of solder. I don't really use an awful lot of solder. I always try and keep the solder to the minimum. I think I used about 6 pieces of solder, which yes, may have been a little bit excessive. But I always make sure though I like to get my soldering operations done the first time, instead of going, oh gosh, there's a gap, there's a join, and you have to pickle it, clean it, flux it, and do the soldering operation again. So there is a happy medium between having too much solder and too little solder. And I think, yes, perhaps I did use a little bit too much solder, but as you saw, we had the most perfect solder joint first time. The next one. Do you make your own pickle? I use peroxide, vinegar and salt. Mine does not seem to work as well. Now, commercially bought pickles, safety pickles, are pretty good, I must admit, and they're best used warm. That's why I've got my little warmer by here. You can use a baby bottle warmer, as I've shown you in many films in the past, or a slow cooker. Pickle always works best when it is warm. You can use your own homemade pickles, as I said, with peroxide, vinegar and salt. It is sustainable, it is eco-friendly and so forth, but I find that they don't work as well. So perhaps the time taken to do the work, waiting for the pickling, is going to take longer. If you're not doing it commercially, it doesn't matter, but in a commercial workshop, a professional workshop, time is money, and the quicker that we can get work through the workshop, the more money that we can make, if that makes sense. Can you use silver with soldering? Can you melt it down and make things from it, as long as you do not mark it 925 but mark the item as silver? I know the quality is lower, but my thought is when you look at silver from other parts of the world where the silver content is much lower than ours. Right, okay, so what they're saying is when we cut the back plate off, if there's any solder in it, can we melt that down? Can we reuse that? Now, solder isn't quite exactly, say, 925 sterling silver. It's slightly below. Too much solder, and here in the UK, it'll fail the assay office test. So if it's not up to scratch, not up to 925, and even if it's 1% less, it'll fail the assay test. So that's why I never put solder in with my melting down when I'm casting, because A, it'll lower the quality, and B, because the solder is in it, it will make the silver perhaps crack, not flow nicely. When you roll it out, you're going to get cracks and so forth. But you can add a little bit of fine silver to that melt to raise the quality, but the solder's still in it. You still may get problems when you're rolling it out, drawing it down and working it and so forth. So in my opinion, it's not worth the hassle. Put that to one side and only use fresh, nice silver with no solder on it when you're melting down. Next question, nearly finished. Okay, so we're looking at, please can just, the meniscus on the bezel. The one you made is lovely. Thank you very much. I have those lovelies more and more these days. Ooh, that's very nice. I like that. Thanks to you. Oh, you're so kind. But then, even though I placed my solder from the outside to avoid any build-up, there still seems to be some meniscus of the solder that can block the smooth sliding of the stone. All right, so what we're looking at here is that whenever you've got a vertical surface and a horizontal surface, when you put some solder on it, the solder will always, what's called a meniscus. It's a little fillet that runs from the bottom up the side, okay? And that can stop the stone from sitting down flush onto the back plate. So what can we do to avoid that? Not use too much solder, obviously, because there won't be as much of a meniscus. Or choose stones that don't have a completely flat back. Sometimes cabochons, the backs on the edges are slightly rounded. That would be ideal to use. But say you've got this meniscus on the inside of the bezel and you've got a flat-backed, sharp, angled stone. The stone won't fit all the way down into the bezel. The easiest thing to do there is do what the Indian jewelry that you can get, like the Navajo Indian jewelry, where they make the turquoise and so forth, is perhaps get some sawdust, put that in the bottom of the bezel, put the stone on top of that, so it acts as a little bit of a cushion. So when you come to push the bezel over, there'll be a slight bit of a nice bit of cushion for that stone, so you're not going to crack it and so forth, and that will keep the stone off the bottom, the back plate, so it avoids the meniscus. Or put a little bit of card, very, very thin card, in the bottom of the bezel for the stone to sit on, just for that stone to sit slightly higher than that meniscus, and you'll be fine. You'll have no problems at all. Another question is, where do you put your solder? Do you put your solder on the inside? Do you put your solder on the outside when we come to solder the bezel onto the back plate? Now, someone says, well, we've always been told to put the solder on the outside. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. It doesn't matter technically, whether you want the solder on the outside or the inside. My only problem would be with that is if you put the solder on the outside and the solder happens to flow on the base, the back plate first, it's going to flow across the back plate. Now, I was talked about cutting off the base and keeping the base to one side if there's no solder on it, but by putting the solder on the outside, if the solder runs, it's going to run across the base. You can't really use that bit of solder for melting down. That'll have to go into your scrap. Also, that bit of solder, if it doesn't flow on the base, it may flow up the side of the bezel. And if it does, you've got to get that solder off the bezel. You have to get all that solder off the bezel because it's on the outside of the bezel and it is going to show if you don't get it off. So you have to buff it, you have to file it and so forth, and that bezel may go slightly thin. So there's two little problems. You may be perfect at soldering and that solder will actually go right between the joint first time. Fantastic, well done, really, really good of you. But if either the bezel is too hot, the solder will flow to the bezel. If the base plate is too hot, the solder will flow onto the base plate without joining the surfaces together. Bad. So that's the reason why I would put the solder on the inside. If the solder flows onto the base plate first, it doesn't matter. It's underneath the stone, it's out of the way, no one can see it. If it flows up the side of the bezel, okay, it's thickened the bezel slightly, but it's out of the way. It's on the inside of the bezel, no one can see it. So that's my argument. I would always try and put it on the inside, especially if you've got a dark stone like this. If it's a clear stone, well then you really shouldn't be putting a clear stone against a back plate. It should always be held with a little bearing wire or some little loops on the inside just to hold that stone. So you shouldn't need to do it that way. So that's it. That's pretty much it. Finally, we have finished. I've put all the links down below to the other films showing how we made the bezel, how we did the back plate, how we soldered the jump ring on and cleaned it all up and so forth. And I hope you enjoyed the series. It's been really enjoyable. We're going to carry on now and just set this down and take a photograph for the thumbnail that you saw at the beginning of this film. So I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comment section down below if you liked it, if you haven't liked it. Let me know your thoughts. If you disagree with what I say, please, there is no rule. There's no right or wrong when it comes to making jewelry. It's your own preferences and how you work. So please, if you think that I talk a load of rubbish, tell me. I'm more than pleased to read how you do things if I've done them wrong. Tell me how you do them. I always love to read. I'm always learning. So don't forget, if you haven't subscribed already, please do. Click by here. No, don't click by there. Click on my face at the end of it or click the subscribe underneath the film. And also smash that little bell icon to be notified when films go live on our YouTube channel. Don't forget, please give this film a thumbs up if you like it. And there's still a couple of people giving this film a thumbs down. Sad. My name's Andrew Berry from At The Benches YouTube channel. Take care. I will see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye. Few films, and we're going to be showing you but we need to be able to hold stone into place. Now we in my turn. Please. Where am I up to now? That's right. Thumbs up if you liked it. Share it with your friends. No, have I said that? I'm not quite sure. Don't forget, please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Smash that little bell icon if that's something that you're into. And don't forget, please give this film a thumbs up if you like it. Oh my God. My voice is going. 40 minutes to do a 20-minute film. Bye.